It started with flashing lights outside our front door and a woman from the HOA pointing at my wife like she just committed a crime. One phone call was all it took for her to try to erase us from our own home. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as authority was weaponized, rules were twisted, and a quiet evening turned into a public humiliation. The HOA president was confident, smug, and absolutely certain she had the power to win. What she didn't know was that she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. Because the person she tried to throw out wasn't powerless at all. And once the truth surfaced, everything changed. But how far can HOA power really go before it destroys the wrong person? Before any rules were weaponized or authority was abused, our life in that neighborhood was quiet, predictable, and deliberately low profile. We had moved there for the same reasons most people do: stability, safety, and the promise that if you followed the rules, you would be left alone. The house wasn't flashy. It wasn't neglected either. It sat neatly in line with the others, trimmed lawn, neutral paint, nothing that screamed for attention. We waved to neighbors, paid our dues on time, and stayed out of community politics. My wife and I valued privacy more than popularity. Our routines were simple. Early mornings, long workdays, evenings spent at home. We weren't the kind of residents who attended HOA meetings or argued over landscaping guidelines. As far as we were concerned, the HOA existed in the background, a bureaucratic necessity rather than a daily presence. For a while, that illusion held. The neighborhood itself had a carefully curated image. Manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, a sense of order that bordered on obsession. On the surface, it felt calm. But underneath that calm was a hierarchy that most people pretended not to notice. Certain residents carried themselves differently. They enforced rules they didn't write, corrected behaviors they didn't own, and spoke with a confidence that suggested power traveled informally, not just through official channels. At the center of that unspoken hierarchy was the HOA president. She had lived there longer than most, knew everyone's business, and treated the community as if it were an extension of her personal authority. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. Her confidence came from knowing people rarely challenged her. Complaints filed under her watch moved fast. Warnings carried weight. Most residents complied quietly, not because the rules made sense, but because resistance felt exhausting. We noticed her attention shift toward our home slowly. It started with subtle inspections disguised as casual walks. Then came the letters. Not aggressive at first. Polite reminders. Carefully worded notices about compliance, phrased in a way that suggested cooperation was expected, not optional. Each letter referenced a rule so obscure it required digging through pages of HOA bylaws just to understand it. Nothing we did felt wrong, yet nothing seemed good enough either. A trash bin left visible for too long. A vehicle parked perfectly legally, but inconveniently, in her opinion. Minor issues, but they arrived with an unmistakable undertone. We were being watched. The strange part was how quickly things escalated. What had once been a peaceful home began to feel like contested territory. The HOA stopped feeling like an organization and started acting like an enforcer. The rules were no longer about maintaining community standards. They were about control. What we didn't realize then was that this attention wasn't random. The HOA president had made assumptions about us. About who we were. About how far she could push. And she believed with absolute certainty that if she applied enough pressure, we would fold like everyone else. She had no idea how wrong she was. What followed felt less like a disagreement and more like a slow, deliberate siege. Once the HOA president's attention fully settled on our house, the rules began multiplying in ways that made compliance feel impossible. Notices arrived weekly, sometimes twice in the same week, each one citing a different clause from a dense, rarely referenced section of the bylaws. The language was technical, cold, and carefully vague, leaving just enough room for interpretation to always land against us. The smallest details became violations overnight. The angle of our trash bins. The timing of when they were brought back inside. The placement of outdoor furniture that had sat unchanged for months. Each issue came with a warning, then a fine, then a reminder that continued non-compliance could lead to further action. What that action meant was never clearly defined, which only made the threat feel heavier. At first, we treated it like a misunderstanding. We corrected what we could, documented everything, and assumed reason would eventually win. But reason was never the goal. The goal was pressure. And pressure works best when it's relentless. Soon, the inspections stopped pretending to be routine. Cars slowed in front of our house. Photos were taken openly. The HOA's presence became constant, a silent reminder that we were no longer just residents. We were targets. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact, not out of hostility, but fear. Nobody wanted to be next. The fines began stacking faster than we could challenge them. Appeals were submitted, then ignored. Requests for clarification were met with automated responses. The system wasn't broken. It was designed this way. Each unanswered appeal drained time, energy, and patience. Each new notice arrived with the same calm authority, as if to say resistance was pointless. The emotional toll crept in quietly. Homes stopped feeling like refuge and started feeling like surveillance territory. Every sound outside triggered unease. Every envelope carried dread. We altered our routines, adjusted our habits, and second-guessed ordinary behavior that had never been questioned before. The neighborhood hadn't changed. The power dynamic had. What made it worse was the unpredictability. 1 week passed without incident, just long enough to let us breathe, and then 3 notices arrived at once. The HOA president wasn't just enforcing rules. She was testing boundaries, seeing how much pressure it took before we broke. And she seemed to enjoy the control. Then came the escalation that made it clear this was no longer about compliance. It was about removal. The tone of the notices shifted. References to residency requirements appeared. Language about unauthorized occupants and temporary displacement began appearing where fines used to be. It was subtle, buried deep in legal phrasing, but the implication was unmistakable. The HOA was positioning itself to question our right to be there at all. We realized then that the harassment had a trajectory. Each fine, each warning, each ignored appeal was building a paper trail. A manufactured history of non-compliance designed to justify something far more severe. The HOA president wasn't reacting anymore. She was executing a plan. The community meetings we once ignored suddenly mattered, but attending them changed nothing. Decisions were made before residents ever entered the room. Votes passed without discussion. Authority was consolidated quietly, efficiently, and without accountability. Anyone who raised concerns was labeled difficult. Anyone who pushed back was marginalized. Our home became the example. The stress intensified when enforcement moved from paperwork to physical presence. Tow notices appeared without warning. Compliance deadlines shortened. Inspections happened daily. The HOA didn't just want us uncomfortable. They wanted us exhausted. And still we stayed. That refusal seemed to irritate the HOA president more than any violation ever could. Her confidence sharpened into something colder. Something impatient. She stopped hiding her involvement and began acting openly, as if daring us to challenge her authority. That was when the most dangerous assumption of all took hold. She assumed we were isolated, that we lacked resources, that we would eventually choose the easier path and leave quietly. She believed the uniformity of the neighborhood meant uniform vulnerability. And she never once questioned why we had remained calm through it all. The turning point came on an ordinary evening, the kind that should have ended quietly. Instead, it marked the moment the harassment crossed into something irreversible. The HOA president escalated beyond fines, beyond warnings, beyond policy enforcement. She involved outside authority, confident that her position would shield her from consequences. The moment law enforcement entered the equation, the power imbalance shifted in a way she couldn't control. But even then, she doubled down. The accusations were severe, unfounded, and delivered with absolute certainty. They carried the weight of official action and the threat of immediate consequences. Neighbors watched as flashing lights reflected off windows. Whispers spread faster than facts. The HOA president stood certain that she had finally forced compliance. What she didn't realize was that every step she took was being documented. Every overreach was recorded. Every assumption was quietly dismantling her position. The moment of exposure arrived quietly but landed like a shockwave. One credential, one verification, one undeniable fact surfaced, reframing the entire situation in seconds. The person she had targeted wasn't just a resident defending their home. She was someone whose professional authority dwarfed the influence of an HOA board. Someone whose understanding of procedure, accountability, and consequence far exceeded the petty power games being played in that neighborhood. The realization hit in stages. First confusion, then disbelief, then fear. The energy shifted instantly. The same authority that had been summoned to enforce removal now had to reassess who had abused the system to get there. The accusations collapsed under scrutiny. The paper trail that was supposed to justify action instead documented harassment. What had been framed as community protection began to look like personal vendetta. Neighbors stopped watching silently. Whispers turned into recognition. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was a public unmasking. The HOA president tried to regain control. She doubled down, insisting on her interpretation of the rules, her understanding of the situation, her right to act. But authority without legitimacy dissolves quickly under inspection. Each attempt to reassert dominance only highlighted how far she had overreached. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was surgical. The same system she had manipulated now turned its attention toward her. Questions were asked about process violations, about false representations, about misuse of influence, about how many others had been pressured the same way, just quietly enough to never fight back. The narrative inverted completely. She was no longer the enforcer. She was the liability. As the situation reached its most volatile point, one fact remained hidden from everyone watching. A fact that would turn the entire conflict inside out. A fact that ensured this wouldn't end quietly. It would end publicly. The days that followed didn't explode with drama. They settled instead, heavy and irreversible, like dust after a collapse. What had been exposed that night could not be unseen, and more importantly, could not be ignored. The HOA president attempted to retreat into silence, but silence no longer protected her. It only highlighted absence of authority, of credibility, of control. The immediate outcome was quiet but decisive. Enforcement against our homes stopped completely. No more notices. No more inspections. No more fines disguised as compliance reminders. The stream of paperwork that had once felt endless dried up without explanation. The system that had moved so aggressively suddenly found reasons to pause, review, and reconsider. That pause said everything. Behind the scenes, consequences began stacking in ways most residents never witnessed. The documentation that had been collected wasn't used for revenge. It didn't need to be. It was used for accountability. The same meticulous records the HOA president had relied on to intimidate were now scrutinized for accuracy, intent, and abuse. Her selective enforcement patterns became impossible to defend when placed side by side with objective timelines. Questions spread through the community like delayed thunder. Residents who had once accepted fines quietly started comparing experiences. Patterns emerged. Stories overlapped. What had felt personal to each household was suddenly communal. The HOA wasn't enforcing fairness. It had been enforcing obedience. Attendance at meetings increased. Not out of rebellion, but out of curiosity. People wanted to understand how power had been allowed to concentrate so completely in one role. They wanted to know how many rules existed solely to be weaponized. They wanted to know how close they themselves had come to being next. The HOA board shifted uncomfortably under that attention. Internal reviews began. Legal counsel was consulted. Procedures were rewritten with urgency rather than care, an attempt to patch vulnerabilities that had been exposed too publicly to deny. The president's influence waned not through a dramatic removal, but through isolation. Decisions no longer flowed automatically through her. Votes slowed. Oversight increased. Authority, once assumed, now required justification. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, the air felt different. Not friendly, not warm, but honest. The unspoken hierarchy collapsed. Neighbors made eye contact again. Conversations restarted. There was still caution, but it was shared, not imposed. Our home regained its meaning. The tension that had hollowed it out receded gradually. Sleep returned. Routine stabilized. The constant vigilance faded. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened fully. The house was no longer contested territory. It was ours again. The long-term consequences for the HOA president were subtle but devastating. Her role became ceremonial. Her recommendations questioned. Her confidence eroded. The informal power she had cultivated through fear vanished because fear only works when people believe resistance is impossible. That belief was gone. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge wrongdoing. She didn't need to. The record spoke for her. And every future interaction she had with the community carried the weight of that exposure. She had learned the cost of assuming silence meant submission. What mattered most wasn't her fall from influence. It was the recalibration of the entire system around her. The HOA, once a blunt instrument, was forced to become transparent. Enforcement guidelines were clarified. Appeal processes were formalized. Oversight mechanisms were introduced, not out of goodwill, but necessity. The neighborhood learned a lesson it hadn't known it needed. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives disguised as procedure. Sometimes it hides behind bylaws. And sometimes, it survives only because no one has challenged it yet. Our experience became a reference point. Not a spectacle, but a reminder. New residents heard about it quietly. Longtime residents referenced it carefully. The message wasn't about retaliation. It was about boundaries. About understanding that rules exist to serve communities, not dominate them. For us, the resolution wasn't just relief. It was clarity. We understood something we hadn't before, that compliance without scrutiny invites abuse. That politeness without limits can be mistaken for weakness. And that silence, while peaceful in the short term, can become dangerous when unchecked authority fills the space. We didn't leave the neighborhood. We didn't sell the house. We didn't retreat. Staying mattered, not as defiance but as proof. Proof that intimidation doesn't get the final word. Proof that systems designed to control can be forced to correct themselves when faced with accountability. The most ironic outcome of all was this. The HOA president achieved the opposite of what she intended. Instead of consolidating power, she fractured it. Instead of enforcing compliance, she inspired awareness. Instead of removing one household quietly, she exposed an entire structure publicly. And that exposure lingered. Months later, the neighborhood still looked the same from the outside. Same lawns. Same mailboxes. Same carefully maintained symmetry. But the internal dynamics had changed permanently. The fear that once kept everyone in line had been replaced with something far more resilient. Knowledge. Knowledge of rights. Knowledge of process. Knowledge of when authority crosses into abuse. That knowledge couldn't be fined away. The story didn't end with a dramatic victory speech or a public apology. It ended with something far more powerful. A system forced to behave because it knew it was being watched. A community reminded that silence protects the powerful far more than it protects the peaceful. And perhaps the most important impact was this. Anyone who had ever felt targeted, pressured, or powerless within that neighborhood now knew one thing with certainty. They were never as powerless as they had been led to believe. Because power that relies on fear collapses the moment it targets the wrong person. And the next time an HOA decides to confuse authority with entitlement, it should remember this. Rules can control behavior, but they can't erase truth. And when truth surfaces, it doesn't knock. It exposes. So the question every homeowner should ask isn't whether the rules are being enforced. It's whether the people enforcing them are ready to be held accountable when they go too far.